Then we talked about the fall of Rome. Remember, Mr. Sanchez doesn't ask a lot of dates from you, but the fall of Rome? Yes? No? Okay. All right, that's okay. As long as you know it for the test. All right, 476 CE. Okay, Rome falls, and the western part of the empire falls into lawlessness and depravity, and there's no law and order and whatnot, ruled by warlords. But in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, if you recall, the empire had been split into two. Constantine, the same Constantine who made Christianity legal, moves his center of power to Constantinople. And so from Constantinople, it becomes known as the Byzantine Empire, continues on for about another 1,000 years. The only emperor and the only real part that, for this class at least, you need to remember is Justinian. And why? Number one, remember, he codified and modified and reformed Roman laws. He basically did it so that, because remember, he reigned 50 years after the fall of Rome. Sometimes I need background music. All right, 50 years after the fall of Rome, and so he didn't want the same thing to happen, in his empire. Heaven forbid the Byzantine Empire ever fell. We're going to make sure that Roman tradition doesn't die with it. He is the last emperor to try to unite the Roman Empire, but unfortunately, because of the German tribes and because of the Persians, he wasn't able to do it. Okay. Oh, and of course, the bubonic plague hit his place first. So he lost over a third of his people. He was responsible for the construction of the Hagia Sophia, big cathedral in Constantinople, which is still around today. And then, of course, the extra bonus part I gave you, he was kind of responsible for a big push in women's rights. Not so much because, he wanted women to have more, but because he recognized that his wife, Theodora, was his better or his equal in a lot of different areas. And so he elevates her to empress, all right, co-ruler with him. And so because of that, women throughout the Byzantine Empire were also given that privilege of having some power and authority. All right. So moving on now, we're going to shift gears and talking about Buddhism. We've seen Buddhism grow and spread. We've seen Buddhism kind of change because of its contact with especially with Greeks, but with other, foreign people. In this case, the monks, and if you want to see an example of a monk, just go to the library, all right? They were the ones that were the missionaries that were out there spreading the ideas of Buddhism. And one of the things that we see during this time now is, number one, there are areas where they start to carve giant statues of the Buddha into sides of the mountain, okay? And of course, to not, lose this advantage, because people are traveling along the Silk Road. We talked about this briefly on Friday. Christian missionaries and Zoroastrian missionaries, and then after 600, Muslim missionaries are traveling along the road. What the Buddhists begin to do is they built their monasteries along the sides of the road. They allow any and all travelers to just come in and rest there because it's a pretty safe area. There's food, there's water. And of course, while you're here, let me share a message with you. All right. And so this was how they were able to bring more people to Buddhism. These are examples. These have been found in Iran, in parts of Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. Statues of Buddha. Now, these are huge. Okay, you have like a human would be like right about here, okay? These are giant statues that were carved into the mountains. And of course, these Buddhas predate their contact with the Chinese so that it's still, skinny Buddha with the little thing on top. All right. Now, moving on to India, okay? by this point in time, okay, we are witnessing a new dynasty in India, and it is known as the Gupta dynasty, okay, because a ruler named Chandragupta, who is different from the Chandragupta who, took over India after Alexander the Great, okay, Chandragupta, he ends up conquering and controlling most of northern India. So this movement is basically in the north, but it begins to spread into other areas. And it is during his reign, it is during the Gupta dynasty, that we see the rise of Hinduism. Okay? Fast forward to today, Hinduism is the most popular and numerous religion in India. It's not Buddhism, even though Buddhism started there. Okay? Well, this is why. Okay? Both Buddhism and Jainism were extremely popular in the cities. People there, they were either Jainist or they were Buddhist, and, they followed the various rules that came along with this, all right? And of course, the priestly class, because remember, both Buddhism and Jainism tend to shirk away from you really don't need a priest. It's more like, self-guided, self-meditation, that search for self, the Eightfold Path, that's something that you encounter on your own. And so the priestly class are kind of, they're like taking all our people away. And so basically, because in the cities, you do have, most people practicing either Buddhism or Jainism, they begin to try to create something where they can appeal to the country folk. All right, the people that are out in the country. And of course, you also have to remember, we talked about this in the previous chapter, in the cities, okay, the whole, idea of the caste system and all of that, well, upper class people see how lower class people live, and the lower class people look at the upper class and ask, wait a minute, what the fuck? Like, why do they get to do all of this cool stuff and I'm stuck here, cleaning the streets and, being disrespected constantly? I know that there is a better life. Okay, so out in the countryside, though, because people are more spread apart and they don't come into contact with each other, the old ideas, those old Aryan beliefs, are still a little bit more popular. There, people are still practicing those, and they tend to stay away from these radical ideas of Buddhism and Jainism. Okay, and so the priestly class then takes that old religion and begins to modify it. Okay, but they do take some examples from both Buddhism and from Jainism. Okay, now Hinduism. All right, unlike Jainism, you don't have to give everything up. Okay, because remember, that's a central part of Jainism. And then Buddhism, well, you kind of have to give up your desire, and you have to kind of detach yourself from anything that's too permanent, because all of it disappears. That's the lesson from this visit. Okay? In this case, Hinduism, you can keep all your stuff, you can feel attachment to whatever you want to feel attached to, except meat. That's the only thing you have to give up. All right? Meat. All right? Cut your attachment to bye-bye bacon and ham and steak and cheeseburgers and all of that. Okay? That's all you need. Okay? You don't have to get rid of all your stuff. You don't have to have your stuff and try to feel no emotional connection or like, this is mine, I work for it. Unlike Buddhism, you don't have to try to remove that desire. The only desire you have to remove is your desire for meat. Okay, that's it. Olivia laughs. I can do that. All right. Just give up steak. Okay. And in this case, as I put down right there, denying yourself meat takes the place of denying your desires and denying your possessions. All right. All you're doing is giving up meat, which for a lot of people it was fairly easy because remember, take a couple hundred years back. They'd already outlawed the killing of cows, so let's just extend it to like the other animals, and it kind of falls in line with the whole concept of ahimsa, where you respect all living things, not just people, but like animals too. So, what greater respect than not eating them? Okay? So yeah, totally made sense. Now, what Hinduism also does is it narrows down the pantheon of gods, makes it a little bit easier, okay, than like Buddhism or Jainism, okay? And so Hinduism has three principal gods. Brahma, Vishnu, the only one I ever remember is Shiva, all right, because Shiva's the god of destruction. Okay, yeah, I know, I'm sick. But, all right, those are the main three gods. Okay, and each one represented, Brahma represents birth, okay, Vishnu represents your life, your existence, and then Shiva represents destruction, okay. All of the other gods, because remember, we've talked about, how there was a particular god that got sacrificed, and that's how everything was created. All of those other gods are just different incarnations of Vishnu, okay? And so in this case, granted, like a long time ago, our ancestors used to worship like 50 gods, but 45 of those were just different, different manifestations of Vishnu. That was Vishnu manifesting himself in a different form so that our ancestors could better understand him. Okay, but in reality, there's only Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and that's it. Okay, so in this case, then we begin to see then this new lifestyle, this new religion, because a lot of people are like, you know what? Yeah, that's way better than trying to detach my feelings from things and not having an emotional connection with. I can stop eating bacon and cheeseburgers and, all of that, and chicken nuggets even. I can give all that up, all right? If I get to still have all the cool stuff in life. And plus, there's so much you can do with cauliflower nowadays. I mean, yeah, all right? Some of you are going, ew, gross. But yes, you're vegetarian, okay? And so little by little, we begin to see then Hinduism grow in popularity. We begin to see then poems and literature and artwork, and the religion spreads so quickly. Like so many Buddhists and Jainists in India just give that up and migrate to Hinduism. Okay? Now, some of the other stuff about Hinduism that makes it easy is that Hinduism, okay, basically says, and you know what? You don't even have to give up your previous gods. You can still worship all of the gods you worshiped before because all of them are just different incarnations of Vishnu. Okay? That's just the way Vishnu appeared to Rupa. If Rupa prays to trees, well, it's because Vishnu appeared to him as a tree. Not because it's a tree god, it's just Vishnu and how Rupa perceived Vishnu. Okay? And people are like, okay, so like if I worship, in this case, Buddha, if I'm Buddhist and I'm part of the new Buddhist movement, the Mahayana, who actually believes that Buddha was a god and not just a teacher, they're like, yes, all right? Buddha is just a different manifestation of Vishnu. That's how Vishnu appeared to Olivia as Buddha, because that's the way that she can understand him. And so, okay, then yeah. So in this case, and that's why today people talk about, oh yeah, Hindus have like hundreds of gods. Technically, yes, but most of those gods are explained away as just different manifestations of Vishnu. And every now and then, Brahma and Shiva, okay? But, all right? Now, in this case now, it's kind of interesting because this movement was started by the priestly class, but eventually, in order to attract more followers, the concept is called bhakti, where you don't need to have a priest telling you what to do. You really don't need a priest. All you really need is to try to develop a personal relationship with the gods, all right? How do you connect to the universe, okay? How do you connect to Brahma and Shiva and especially Vishnu, all right? Beyond that, you don't really need anything else. And so this is why number one, people were like, yeah, that does sound like a better deal. Okay. And oh, by the way, we're still going to do that whole death, rebirth, reincarnation, death, rebirth, reincarnation. And eventually you do need to, nirvana. And you do need to follow the rules in order to move up into different social classes. Okay? But what's the only thing you have to get rid of? Meat. Okay? Everything else, yeah, you're good. All right? You don't have to worry. All right? Of course, you eat a cheeseburger, then boom, yeah, you're going back a caste. All right, type of thing. So for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, I can give up meat in this lifetime if it guarantees that I'll be able to move up into the next one. All right? Now, as I mentioned, okay, the older form of Buddhism, the original Buddhism, it eventually becomes known as Hinayana. All right, the newer Buddhism, the Buddhism that believes that Buddha is an actual god, is Mahayana. All right, but we begin to see then around 200, all right, CE, we begin to see changes. Okay, and in this case, and I put there, it becomes more monkish. All right, because obviously Buddhism is losing followers to Hinduism. Okay, and the few people who remain Buddhist, they feel that the best way to preserve their beliefs and their religion is to begin to isolate themselves, okay? Live a life of bigger denial, and, this way we keep those evil Hindu ideas out of our minds by, just moving away and meditation and prayer and, doing, all of these things and continuing this personal journey towards nirvana without these outside influences that might detract us and say, hell, all I have to do is give up meat and I'm saved. No, okay? So in this case, we begin to see then a lot of those changes that happened because of the Greek influences, they begin to get rejected, okay? And so we're only going to stick to the words that we know came from the Buddha. Of course, it's been about 600 years. So, how do you know what actually came from the Buddha and what was added later on, like, when the Greeks came in and affected the religion, all right? But, these monks, they begin to reject those newer words. And of course, yeah, we saw the statues. Yeah, we saw, like, all of these illustrations of the Buddha. But they tend to revert back. So now we're going to stick to simple drawings, to simple imagery. We're not going to make the Buddha like all powerful. We're not going to do like a buff Buddha or something like that. We're going to keep it simple, all right? To what we feel is, the original representation of who he was. Okay? Now, during this time, okay, because now we're moving along several hundred years, and Greek begins to, especially here, not necessarily in Europe and whatnot, but Greek little by little begins to fade away. We see that loss of prestige that's been around, well, at least between 600 years and almost 1500 years, okay? And Sanskrit replaces Greek as the language of education, as the language that unites the people, okay? And most of the people in this area could either read it or understood Sanskrit, and so Hinduism especially, because they adopt Sanskrit, Hinduism becomes even more popular and more accessible to the common people, okay? And so, in this case, and this I will ask you, you need to know what the Code of Manu is. It's basically the Hindu holy book. I hate calling it the Hindu Bible because it's not really the Bible, but if that helps you to remember it, it's the Hindu Bible, all right? But it's the Hindu holy book, and basically it begins to talk about, number one, how communities should be organized, okay? The different classes and where they live and who they do all these things with, okay? Obviously, because during this time, a lot of people were converting to Hinduism. How do we welcome them into the community? What are the things that we do so that they stay with us? What are the things that we do to help them make that transition from their previous religious beliefs to Hinduism? And then finally, and this is the biggest part of the Code of Manu, because they do adopt, those old Vedic beliefs, okay? And this is actually where we get, part of it we get from Megasthenes and his observations of India, but most of it we get from here, okay? What are the different rules for each of the Varnas? What are the different rules for each of the Jatis? Who can you marry? Who can you associate with? Who can you talk to? What are you supposed to do? Okay, what are you allowed to do? What can you eat even? All right, obviously can't eat meat, and that applies to everyone, but the lower class people were limited in some of the things that they could eat versus the higher class people. And then the ones in the middle had a totally different dietary restriction. I know, it seems really weird, but it was all laid out in the Code of Manu. Okay, so it gives sample, and it even has, I didn't put it up there, but it even has behavior of men and women, courtship rituals. If you've ever been to an Indian wedding, those things are like 5 days long. And it's an intricate, most of that comes from the Code of Manu as to what needs to be done and the different traditions. Bless you. Okay. I've never been to one, but my ex-wife and my daughter were invited to one, and my daughter then we went for 3 days of it, only, I say. And my daughter was like, Dad, they had these festivals and dancing, and everyone got tattooed. It's henna. And so there's different parts to it, and most of that is from the Code of Manu, all right? It outlines all the things that you do, okay? And so, in this case then, both Buddhism, Hinduism spreads throughout India. Buddhist missionaries then begin to travel, and this is when we begin to see Buddhism then spreads into China and Southeast Asia, and so Buddhism undergoes more changes once it gets there. As I mentioned, when we all think of Buddha now, we think of the chubby one. That's Chinese influence, okay? So once it reaches these other areas, once again, Buddhism changes even more, okay? I'm going to stop right here because I don't want to start Mexico and then have to stop in about 5 minutes, all right? But